Peter Drucker once said, "What gets measured gets managed." Welcome to this 30-day live stream on entrepreneurship. My name is Jürgen Moors. I'm a coach, a strategic advisor, and a consultant. And today we talk about measuring the success and the impact of you as and your endeavors as an intrapreneur. From that, also the quote, "What gets measured gets managed." But there's also the risk if trying to measure too accurately or too much. This is also something that you have to be very aware of. We've been talking about a journey of becoming a very successful entrepreneur. And as I said already so many times, in the beginning, you typically take on smaller innovations, smaller projects, smaller change efforts, and they grow as time progresses. Now, for those smaller efforts, it's sometimes easier to define one metric or a set of metrics that you can actually use to see from was I successful, or was the project successful, or was the innovation successful. As you progress and the impact becomes bigger and the projects and innovations become truly radical innovations or breakthrough innovations, coming up with a set of success measurements can be a lot more challenging. And because the impact is a lot broader, sometimes you also have to look at how do I measure success in a broader area? And it's not necessarily financial. You need to broaden your spectrum and, and search for the right metric, because even when you bring bigger innovations, bigger breakthroughs, it can be very risky if you focus too much on one very simple metric. If you can, without jeopardizing the whole effort that you do, then do it, of course. But be aware that as your impact and the impact on the organization grows, you need the right set of metrics. And it sometimes is also an effort to find those sets of metrics to validate the efforts that you actually have been doing. And that's a little bit what we're going to look at throughout this episode, to see from, okay, where can we get these typical metrics? How do you look upon them? Do not make them holy or saints. The metrics are not necessarily the saints, where sometimes a lot of people think they are, but they are not. But first, let's kick off from how do you find success metrics for your intrapreneurial project? Like I said, when you have a very small change and you can see a direct relationship between the change, the innovation that you do, and the result that it will end up in. For instance, if you bring a new product and it is not cannibalizing anything else, you can track very easily the penetration that it has in your key market, in your target market. You can see the amount of revenue that you create from it. If you also produce it, you can see the manufacturing cost, you can see your margins. So there are many things how you can track this, but this is a very simple, isolated case. If you look at, for instance, the project that I have been talking about, this masterpiece, where the impact was throughout the organization at a large unit on different aspects of the organization, coming up with one single metric that would define everything would not be so easy, because it's also a long-term effort, and tracking the success of a long-term effort takes a lot more challenge in time, because the big benefits for the organization, when we look purely at the euros or the dollar point of view, they would only come towards the end of this 10-year road. So they would come starting year 4, 5, and then actually up to 10, they would really become huge and be a huge payback for the investments that we did in the first 5 years. But in those first 5 years, and especially in the first 2 years, there the metrics or the set of metrics that we should use should be completely different. So also, when you have longer term projects, when you have bigger innovations, radical innovations that take you over a longer period of time, you need to define metrics that help you and guide you along this path, along this journey. So a metric at the end, but there also need to be certain metrics somewhere in between. And It can be a mixture of metrics. On the one hand side, I already gave you an example, which is revenue growth, for instance, of a very quantitative metric. Cost savings, when it's versus cost saving, it can be a very quantitative measure. It can also be the amount of output that you generate, the amount of people that you actually save in that case, which can also, again, in cost. There are a lot of quantitative metrics that you can actually define when you're looking at a project. But there are also a lot of qualitative metrics. And when you look at a customer point of view, when you come up with a new product, is of course customer satisfaction. When you change the product, you can also look at customer satisfaction. When you have a new business model, you can see from how does this business model compete with the others. When you look at process innovations, there you're going to look more at typically at cost savings. But you also have metrics on other parts of, is our culture changing? It's more qualitative. Is our team engagement changing? That's also more qualitative. So you can define a whole set of metrics, and ideally, you have a good mixture of the quantitative aspect and the qualitative aspect. And in my case, for instance, the quantitative aspect was coming later in the project when I talked about my masterpiece. Some of them were in the first half of it, but the biggest amount of metrics that I had in the beginning were qualitative metrics. Um, a metric that is also important that you should forget, it's not just the benefits that you create, but if you do a project and you say from, I expect this to have a budget of X, tracking the X budget, that you not have a huge overspend, but also the time frames that you define. These are also metrics that are typically linked to a project, but they are also important when you bring this innovations as well. So don't only look at the results, but also look at the metrics that are typically for a project when you do a project in the end. Now, what are tools and techniques for measuring? They're, of course, similar to project tracking, similar to other ways how we can measure um, quantitative or qualitative results. This can be data that you actually gather. For instance, when you bring revenue, you can actually get this in the revenue sheet and the balance sheets that you have, that you can actually see and track it. So it's data gathering that you do. When you're looking at customer satisfaction, when you're looking at the culture, yeah, it's typically a survey, a culture survey, a customer survey that you do to get the qualitative data and quantify them to some kind of extent. Actually, the feedback from people or the motivation of people, the engagement of people in a group of organization, the general output of your group of the organization in itself, which can be measured in different ways of having a lot more efficiency in it. You can bring analytics in it and track it all the way. So the typically measurement tools that you have and that are existing for quantitative and qualitative analysis, they are as valid here as anywhere else. Um, Popular tools are also key performance indicators, but like I said before, when you look at key performance indicators, make of course the difference between the ones that are actually the drivers and the lagging ones, where only you measure the results, but you don't have a direct influence, where the direct performance indicators you can influence. Um, but be aware that you have a good mixture of them, especially for a larger project, or you might focus too much on one aspect of your innovation, and it might also risk your innovation. You have also your OKRs, or objective and key results. This is something that, for instance, in our case, or in my case, I did, especially in the first the 4 years. There we had very clear objectives. What are we going to do in the first quarter? What are we going to do in the second quarter? What will we, or should we reach by the end of the year? Because we knew that a lot of the innovations that we were bringing would only come on stream just because they took time to build 2 or 3 years later. So we need to make sure that the objectives that we had, that we could track the timeline, that we could keep the timeline, the budgets that were important, and then there we had very clear objectives, but also objectives when we did the surveys. We had a regular culture feedback, a cultural survey. So every year we could see, is our culture progressing in a certain direction? The culture survey was something that was done on a corporate level, so I could use this. And then we would pick out one or two areas in that survey where we said, okay, here we need to become a lot better if we want to reach the point in 10 years we want to be. For one example, give you that the first year, this was the baseline measurement in 2017 or 18, I think. We had a pretty low score, or a really low score on, for instance, innovation and cooperation inside the unit. So I picked out those two, and I said, okay, now let's do and define objectives and a program on how, while we are doing the innovations, we can get better in this. And as I told you before, in this masterpiece, in the first 2 years, we tested a lot. We had this all kinds of robots that we were testing, all kinds of new technologies that we were introducing and testing. Some we kept on using, some had to be changed, and some we said, okay, these don't make any sense in our environment. But by just doing that, people saw from, okay, where in the past we did not so much in innovation, we are now testing a whole lot and we are keeping certain things. So when the second survey came 2 years later, we progressed hugely on, or a huge amount on the innovation. People really saw from, okay, now we are also working on innovation. So this is how we could track that and how we could see that. And the same thing for working together, where in the beginning working together on all levels was assessed not so good. um, we could see a huge progress in the cooperation in the day shift, and because we could make a difference between people that were on a 24/7 shift and we could, the people that were on a day shift, and we could see that those that were on a day shift, that they gave the score on the question a way better score than we had 2 years ago. So they already saw progress based on the program we defined. But the 24/7 shift, we also saw a step forward, but not where we didn't want to go. So we use that to say, okay, in the day shift, we need to make it in a little bit of an additional effort, and we need to tailor a program exactly towards the 24-hour shift. And a lot of times that had to do with the communication aspects, not that we didn't try to communicate or that people didn't try to communicate in both directions. The efforts were definitely there, but it was simply because they're shifted every 2 days into a new system, for meaning from they shifted there were 2 days during the day, during the morning, 2 days during the night, and then 2 or 3 days during the late shift. So it shifted continuously, and that made it a little bit challenging to find the right way to communicate. But as time progressed, we solved a lot in that as well, without saying that we ever became really, really perfect. Yeah. And then once when you have that, when you have your techniques for measuring, then you can see from what are my results, how I'm going to draw insights. Um, Also be very wary of when you draw results based on quantitative or qualitative measurements, whether it's on KPIs or on OKRs. Always be very careful with one-time measurements, because one-time measurements, they sometimes can be falsely interpreted or give you a false direction. It's better to have several measurements that give you a certain trend, because sometimes you think you are hugely better, but then in the end you see from, okay, the trend is not good. Because with this survey that I gave you, this cultural survey, I could have scored really a lot better on innovation in the second survey, and maybe in the third survey it would be again assessed very lowly. In our case, because we kept on working and focusing on it, of course it did not. But you have to be wary with the first measuring point or with just one point. Try to gain as much points as you can, because it gives you the trend in which direction you are evolving. Especially for qualitative aspects, this is crucial, because otherwise it might be that you analyze it in a wrong way. So when you also analyze it, be very try to make a connection between what you did and the result that you have, but also look at the external influence, especially in a qualitative way, because we also saw that not just on a unit base, but how the company as itself performed, and the communications that came from the company in itself, how they were brought, and how that was set up, and what the trends were there. This was also a certain reflection inside the communication or inside the survey. So, and that is a little bit tricky to make a difference between what is caused by somebody else and what is caused by your true efforts. Excuse me. So But it helps you once when you start gathering these results. It helps you, of course, like I said, after a couple of measurements to get the trends, and you see where you're going, and you also can see from, do I have to adjust? Am I moving in the right direction? Can I keep this as it is and move on, or have to put some additional effort in it? Less or no, like I said before, in the innovation aspect, we definitely nailed it and moved on. In the communication aspect, we had to add certain things. But then you also have, especially when you look at qualitative data, and you do surveys, at some point in time, you think from, okay, I'm spending a certain amount of effort, or spending a lot of time of effort in it, but I don't see any big change anymore. It looks like I'm reaching a plateau. At that point in time, it's really crucial to go into communication with the people that are actually taking those surveys, and ask or try to understand together with them, why are we reaching this plateau? There might be a reason that you never score higher. In certain countries, they not tend to ever, when you have to give a score between 0 and 10, you will know that people will never give you a 0 over 10. So you will never meet the max score. The 1 and the 9 are already very rare. So you typically, when you're doing a good job, you're somewhere on 8, and when you're doing a really bad job, you're 2. But you're never in the externalities or extremities. Other countries have no problem with using the whole range. So also look at the cultural aspects when you do this, because they change in region, they change in culture and in country as well. So also take that in apart when you're actually analyzing results and trying to draw insights. It's always also good, when you look at the results, and even when they are very good, not to say, yes, we made it, we are going in the right direction. It's still also okay at all the different point in time, when you gather the data, when you're analyzing the data, to question yourself from, okay, am I measuring what I'm looking for? Because in the beginning, you might have set up a certain measurement, a certain quantitative or qualitative measurement, but as it progresses, you see that it no longer, or it doesn't reflect what you actually were after. So when you see that, when you then either adjust it or don't use it at all, because you will, yeah, you will try, or you're starting to tell yourself stories that are not true. So definitely look at that. And once you're measuring it, and you have ways of measuring it, also communicate it. When you have success, or even when there is no success, actually talk about this in a broader team, because it's crucial as an entrepreneur, especially when you're trying to bring people on board for new innovation. They also like to find out, okay, what's happening now? What are the results that we're actually reaching? The effort, the change that we are actually doing and we are undergoing, does it bring something, or doesn't it? Tell them the story on a fair and an honest way. If it takes time and the first results are not what they are, like I said, then also bring that. And like I told you before, I never had, with changes, the issue that my ego was in the way when something appeared after a couple of times not to work. Yeah, don't be afraid to abandon it. It is okay that something fails. That's part of being an entrepreneur, and we sometimes forget that. We think that we have to make everything a success as an entrepreneur, but that is simply not the case. And then if you have those clear metrics, explain those metrics and show the results that you're actually doing. For instance, for the survey, the culture survey, and the aspects that were really important in developing this culture to a changing culture, to an open culture, to an innovating culture. Every year or every 2 years, as the survey was organized centrally, then I would go back to the whole team and show them, "Look, this is the progress that we made." And I also showed them, this were the measure points earlier. This is the action plan that we had defined, and this is where we are now. And we can see that there where the actions were taken, we made progress. And here is a point where we took a lot of action and we didn't make any progress. And then trying to understand that, because especially with survey questions, with qualitative data that you actually start to gather, people have all different backgrounds, different understandings. So the way they interpret a certain question and the answer that they will give to that might vary and has an impact on what you're trying to measure. You can come up with a very good question and you think it's perfect with the 5 scales that you define, but somebody else might look completely different at it. And to give you an example, in this survey, there was a question about cooperation. And if you read the question really carefully. It focused on the cooperation between different units. So basically, the question was set up to assess the cooperation across silos. But a lot of people assessed or understood the question as an assessment of the cooperation between the different teams. And between the cooperation with silos was not running so well at the time when we started, where the cooperation internally was a lot better. It was not at the level that we needed to go, but it was a lot better. But so typically the assessment was higher than it should have been. And in another question, it was exactly the other way around. They assessed how we were in comparison to an assessment. They actually looked at something external. Um, so, and in my case, when I was the utilities, most of my customers were internal customers. I didn't have external customers. And typically there was a question about, do you understand your customers' needs? And the question was typically designed for the external customer. So in our case, we should have all answered not applicable. And a lot of people did that. But there were also a lot of people who assessed how we acted towards the internal customers. But that was not the feedback that they were looking after in this question. That came in another question. So when you devise your surveys to look for, okay, how am I moving forward as an entrepreneur with my projects, take care of that as well. Communication, we've already talked about, is very tricky. So also in devising your questions, coming up with your questions and your answers, is there room for interpretation? Ask yourself that question. Is here room for interpretation? And a big chance is the answer is yes. Yeah. So always when you analyze results, try to draw insights, do it also very with a critical view on it. To be honest, from was my measurement tool the right tool? Because sometimes, as you measure, I already said it, it can be that your measurement tool was not the right tool. And take this in the communication, like I said before, because people also like to know what is done with, especially when you take surveys. They take the time and the effort to fill it out. So make sure that you tackle back to that quantitative data that you get out of a system. Um, the system doesn't will not ask you from tell me what you did with my data. Also use them to bring the story to your to the group and to everybody that it belongs to. But especially when you have qualitative data, when you ask people for something, make sure that you also have their that they have a feedback loop. Same thing to all the stakeholders. Try to bring the feedback at the level. I also try to, I always had a communication also towards the upper management. So those who granted me the money and supported me on a half yearly or a yearly basis, where they got an update, where I then brought together high level and all kinds of different aspects in that, so that they had the right feedback. People in my teams would receive the feedback that they were looking for. So something that was important to them on a day-to-day basis, for instance, where, for instance, the C-suite, they were looking at long-term influence and what we reached in general. So to finish off, I would just like to tell you about this masterpiece. And there we had a really broad range of yeah, measurement tools, whether it was qualitative, like I said, where we measured the survey, whether it was quantitative, where we looked at, okay, how much more efficient do we become. And it was also during that period, during this first couple of years, where we continuously updated our KPIs and our ways that we measured success. To give you for one example is, for a while I knew, because I saw the amount of work that we were doing, that with a team we would become a lot more successful. But it was hard for me to pin down this: we are more successful, we are more efficient, and report it to the team, but also to management. And everybody knew that we had become more efficient, that we had done more work, but we were looking for a measurement. So we started looking at, what's the total amount of work, how can we represent that? And basically, if you tracked it towards the true time, it was when I joined, they had their operational budget, and this was the maintenance budget, and small changes budget, for instance, and effectively the operational budget that the amounts that they produced and distributed. When we actually were going through this trajectory, the amount that we produced and distributed went up. That was one thing. Our maintenance budget, because we did an effort to bring on stream a lot more higher reliability and aspects like that, was also going up. The changes, so we tried to repair a lot of the smaller changes and change the installations where there were a lot of problems. And on top, we had this huge investment budget for new projects. And when I looked at the base team, operational base team, it was still the same amount of people. So for me, this was a way that we measured at the time efficiency. How much more work in euros we did in comparison with 3, 4, 5 years before show as a measurement for efficiency. And at the same time, because we had some temporary project people on board, we also looked, okay, what does one person in a project, how much money does one person actually take care of? Is it 5 million euro project in a project value? Is it 20 or 50? And then we also start tracking from the better we get and the more experience we get over this period of 5 to 10 years, the higher also the amount of money that a one project leader or project manager should be able to do, depending on the complexity of the project, because it's easier to have one standalone installation that represents a lot of money in comparison where you have a project that is a setup of, let's say, 50 different sub projects with all with the small budgets and a lot of interactions in the installation. It was a lot more complicated. So we also looked at the complication of it. So those two factors we also managed to watch it. And then we start, like I said, tracking how the innovations really started to come on stream, how they made it more efficient, how we could, where we said, okay, normally we would have had to hire a person, but because we had these innovations that became more efficient, we can postpone it. So postponement of hiring additional people was also showing how we became more efficient. So you have to be very open to, as long as it progresses, from what kind of metrics do I have, and try to bring as much, especially if you do a really big project with a lot of impact on a lot of organizations and a lot of silos. You have to really look for, okay, how can I bring this all together? And this brings me really to the end of this session about metrics. How do you measure success? And like I said, quantitative, qualitative. Be careful what you measure. Be always very aware of what you measure and on the results, and communicate about those results to all the stakeholders in a fair and open way, because that brings this flywheel that I talked about a couple of times and makes it faster and faster and faster as an entrepreneur. Um, that was it for day 24 of the 30-day live stream. I'd love to see you tomorrow when we dive into day 25. But one takeaway for today that I would give you is, think about a complex project that you would like to do, or that you're doing as an entrepreneur, and try to come up with a very diverse and not necessarily straightforward way of measuring its success. Try to come up with 3 different ways of measuring success, where you say one is really quantitative, one is really qualitative, and one is really out of the box. Because that's in the end what you also will have to do as an entrepreneur. Even for the measurement of your success, you will have to learn to think out of the box. And with that, I see you tomorrow, and then we will dive into how do we, on an expert level, gain more support and sponsorship from the executive level. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.